The Iran-Contra affair is a polarizing piece of American history that makes one wonder just what are the limitations of the U.S. government as it pertains to the executive branch. Although the term is said as if this were one event, it's actually two separate instances of pressing the limits of the law that eventually come together based on one decision and one instance of really bad luck. To begin, I want to give a brief background of what was going on at the time that precipitated the affair. The Cold War is in full swing, and President Reagan is willing to do almost anything in order to prevent the spread of and eventually to eradicate communism. The president quickly identified two regions he felt were of the highest importance as it pertained to preventing the spread of Soviet doctrine. The first area was Iran. At this point in time, the leadership in Iran had swung to a side that no longer wanted to be friendly with the United States. This seemed to be mostly for religious reasons, and as such, leadership had full backing of the Muslim population. The U.S., wary of losing its oil-rich friend and desperate to keep Soviets from influence in the region, quickly moved to normalize relations with Iran. Despite these efforts, the Muslim followers of the line of the Imam, a fundamentalist anti-imperialist group made up predominantly of young radical revolutionaries, seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran on November 4, 1979, which was the beginning of the end of cordial diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran. 53 hostages were taken that day, and even though they would all later be released, other kidnappings were sure to follow. The second area of concern to the Reagan administration was Central America. The country that seemed most vulnerable to Soviet influence was that of Nicaragua. Even before the affair, the United States had a long-standing policy of keeping up with the political climate in Nicaragua. At this point in time, Sandinista National Liberation Front, a group inspired by and closely connected to Cuba, had taken control of the Nicaraguan government. The group had signed an agreement with the USSR and had begun to receive aid to include weapons from the USSR by way of Cuba. The Nicaraguan Democratic Force, otherwise known as the Contras, were the only thing standing in opposition of said group. There are basically two important legal issues that make dealing with these two regions very difficult. The first is Operation Staunch, an embargo on Iran preventing us from selling them weapons due to their terroristic activity. This included third-party sales, which meant any country that was allowed to legally purchase weapons from the U.S. could not then turn around and sell them to countries on the embargo list. The other legal issue was Boland Amendment 2, which states, no appropriations or funds made available pursuant to this authorization bill to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, or any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activities may be obligated or expended for the purpose of which would have the effect of supporting directly or indirectly military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua by any nation, group, organization, movement, or individual. In layman's terms, this made it illegal to fund the Contras. Now at this time, Iran is at war with Iraq. Although Iran has taken more U.S. hostages, they secretly reach out to the administration to buy weapons. Despite the embargo, the administration looked at this as a way to possibly get the hostages free. The deal specifically called for the selling of 100 American-made TOW anti-tank missiles to Iran via Israel in exchange for some, if not all, American hostages and open communications with Iran. America would send replacement TOWs to Israel, also part of the deal. 96 TOW missiles were sent to Iran, but there was no hostages released. It wasn't until after a second shipment, this time of 406 TOW missiles, that the release of one hostage was gained. The profits of the arms sales at this time were going to the middlemen who arranged the transfers. There was still the matter of replenishing the Israeli weapons stores. To help facilitate that, a cover company called the Stanford Technology Trading Group International, also known as Enterprise, was formed. Israel could now transfer money into this account and purchase weapons from the U.S. to replenish stores. At the same time things are going down in Iran, the Contras are facing their own controversy. The Sandinistas outnumber and outgun the Contras at every turn. Oliver North has been put in charge of the National Security Council and given orders to help the Contras if he can. He's supposed to find ways to provide them with funding and equipment, but keep Congress out of it. His solution was to open the Enterprise account and then start asking for private donations. He talks to countries of interest as well as private donors such as Ross Perot. The money goes into the account and then is given to the Contras as needed. Once he gets the money flowing, his biggest problem seems to be getting the aid to the Contras. He eventually ends up getting some planes and a crew that were purchased by a different shell company but are no longer being used and is able to fly missions whenever it's convenient. It is said that they got things running so smoothly that the Contras had to ask them to stop the deliveries. Neither shipment to Iran produced the agreed upon number of hostages. It had become clear the middlemen aren't living up to their end of the bargain. In lieu of this, the administration developed a second channel to be the liaison from the U.S. to Iran. The first channel was developed by Israel, and as such, Israel had some skin in the game and wanted these folks to stay in the loop. The administration agreed, but to what extent, no one really knows. At the same time the second channel was being formed, the president signed a presidential finding making it possible for the direct sale of arms to Iran. Proceeds were diverted to the enterprise account. That money was used to continue to help the Contras. It turned out not to be a significant amount of money, as estimated less than $3 million, but the act in and of itself would be what links these two affairs together. The whole scandal comes apart almost simultaneously due to two significant events. The first event was the shooting down of the C-123 plane that was carrying 10,000 pounds of small arms and ammunition to the Nicaraguan Democratic Force. The pilot crossed into Nicaraguan airspace earlier than what was intended and ended up getting shot down by a 14-year-old with an anti-air missile. Only one of the people on board had a parachute. He was the only survivor. At about the same time in Germany, the administration was meeting with the Iran Second Channel about a new plan to exchange weapons for hostages. The original plan started out with 7 steps, the most important of which were 1, to make sure that all American hostages were finally released, and 2, to provide the body and copy of debrief of William Buckley. But during negotiations, Oliver North had to leave due to the news of the C-123 being shot down. He left a middleman in charge who ended up negotiating the release of 1.5 hostages, with all efforts to get the second hostage release, and 2, no mention of William Buckley at all. With all of this bad karma coming about, it wouldn't be long before the administration was in full cover-up mode. Key officials were in their offices shredding everything they could get their hands on. Stories were being fabricated in order to minimize each individual's exposure to damage. Documents that weren't shredded were being doctored and sometimes even smuggled out of the office underneath shirts and inside of shoes. It was a veritable every man and woman for themselves. 3 mechanisms were established to uncover the truth of the Iran-Contra affair in hopes of regaining public trust in addition to fully understanding the scandal. A special review board known as the Tower Commission appointed by President Reagan, an independent counsel, and the holding of immunized joint congressional hearings. The Tower Commission was created with the purpose of evaluating the operation of the National Security Council in general and the role of the NSC staff in particular. The Tower Commission released its findings concluding that the NSC itself was sound. Although the Tower Commission did not find President Reagan guilty, nor claim that they knew more than he was leading on to, it did argue that Reagan should have been more informed, criticizing his managerial style of running the White House for causing him to act with neglect and lack of oversight. The joint congressional hearings were little more than a dog and pony show, as evidenced by their purpose statement of, quote, "Our hearings are neither pro-Contra nor anti-Contra, neither pro-administration nor anti-administration. We are not prosecutors, and this is not an adversarial proceeding. We meet here as American citizens, united in a common effort to find the facts, lest we repeat the mistakes." Finally, the legal aftermath of the Iran-Contra affairs, as judged by the independent counsel, includes 14 people that were criminally charged. Of those 14, 4 were convicted of felony charges, most of which were later reversed on appeal. 7 pleaded guilty to either felonies or misdemeanors. 1 case was dismissed, and 2 that were awaiting trial were pardoned by President Bush. The Iran-Contra affairs had and continue to have far-reaching ramifications for the executive. It brings into question just what are the powers of the president as it pertains to keeping the country safe. Should the president be limited in what they may do, When it comes to foreign policy and the overall protection of U.S. citizens both home and abroad, some say that those involved in the affairs were simply executing orders and doing what it took when Congress wouldn't. Others will say that this is the very definition of overreach and the reason for checks and balances. One thing is for sure. The affairs prove that the burden of proof, as it pertains to these questions, is tremendously high. The odds of convicting a president of wrongdoing in situations like this going forward are very slim.